Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. We have a great guest today and a topic that I think is crucial, but really under-considered. So let me introduce the JPC and our work before we turn to our excellent guest, Sean Durns. JPC is a 501c3 organization founded in 1985, providing perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policies, that's policies, not politics, by leading scholars, academics, and commentators. You can sign up for our articles, which are published under the heading of Insight on our website. The website is jewishpolicycenter.org. You will not only find Insight, but you will find our quarterly magazine, inFOCUS, as well as our blogs, In Context, Frontline Defense, and Alliance Tracker. I hope you will visit jewishpolicycenter.org. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. We oppose any nuclear deal with Iran on the grounds that Iran cheats. Always, fundamental principle for us. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. In this series of phone calls, we've been all over the world, from Israel to China to Azerbaijan, Syria, the Persian Gulf, South America, and heavy attention recently, obviously, on Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. We've done some domestic issues, including the Supreme Court, school choice, and back to the Supreme Court again, and Iran. So we've done Iran's nuclear program. We've done Iran's domestic repression. We've done Iran's support for Hamas and Hezbollah. But as I said, I think that we have overlooked something, and we're going to get to it today, and that is the role of Iran in fomenting civil unrest among Israel's Arab population. We have overlooked it, but fortunately, our guest, Sean Durns, has been right there on topic, including in the current issue, by the way, of inFOCUS magazine. Again, a chance for me to boost our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. Sean Durns is in inFOCUS spring issue. Sean is a senior research analyst for CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy, I have to get this right, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, CAMRA, which is 65,000 members based in Boston. Sean is based here in Washington. Prior to working for CAMRA, he worked for two DC-based think tanks and for a former US Undersecretary of Defense. He has a master's degree in diplomatic history from the London School of Economics, where his thesis focused on early Cold War era Middle East policies. And that's probably one to read. His recent articles include Iran's growing drone menace, Amnesty International's baseless attack on Israel, China's rare earth mineral policy, and Netflix giving Munich a revisionist history. You know Netflix is losing subscribers. If you haven't canceled your Netflix subscription, take a poke at Sean's article on Netflix and Munich and think about canceling it, okay? The best part about Sean's bio is that he and his wife, Sarah, live in the DC area with numerous rescue cats and dogs. I love that. Public service announcement. You are muted. You cannot speak. However, you can use the Q&A function on your screen and send us questions. I will be monitoring the questions and I will provide them to Sean after he speaks. But right now, Sean Durns, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shoshana. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to offer my thanks to Shoshana and the Jewish Policy Center team for inviting me to talk about my essay in the spring quarterly issue. As Shoshana mentioned, I work for CAMRA. For those who are unfamiliar, CAMRA is a 65,000 member organization that advocates for fair and accurate coverage of the Middle East and related issues. And for those who follow the Middle East closely, certainly to those who are on this call, it is no secret that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a revisionist power that seeks regional hegemony. In fact, the ambitions of Iran's ruling theocrats are more than regional. They're global, seeking to export Iran's Islamic revolution abroad. And a key aspect of Iran's vision, a chief goal that they seldom fail to mention, is the destruction of Israel. For those who pay close attention to the Middle East in general, and Israel in particular, it might not be news that crime in general, and violent crime in particular is rising in Israel's Arab communities. More than rising, it has been exploding. What this has to do with Iran is, of course, the subject both of this call and of my article in JPC's spring issue. In 2013, there were 58 homicides in Israel's Arab neighborhoods. A mere 7 years later, in 2020, that figure more than doubled with a reported 108 homicides. The next year, 2021, witnessed another increase with an astounding 126 reported murders. And I want to stress as well, that's reported. The figure is actually probably quite higher. 62 of those murder victims were under the age of 30, and 83% of those homicides were perpetrated with firearms. We'll be touching upon the significance of those latter two statistics shortly. Now let's put this in perspective. Israeli Arabs constitute roughly 21% of the population, yet they make up almost 3/4 of the homicide victims in Israel. That's a horrific figure. Between 2016 and 2020, homicides among Israeli Jews fell by about 19%. While homicides among non-Jews rose by about 61%. So the imbalance there is striking. And the Western press has writ large covered it with all the judiciousness, fairness, and context that one can expect when it comes to media coverage of Israel. Completely kidding, of course. In fact, the media has done the usual bang-up job, which one has come to expect when it comes to covering the Jewish state. They've performed abysmally. Israeli Arabs are murdering Israeli Arabs, and many in the Western media would like you to believe that this is somehow the fault of Jews and the Jewish state. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, The Guardian, and other habitual offenders have tried to portray the rising murder rates in Israel's Arab communities as a result of inequities and inattention. One October 2021 New York Times report, for example, was headlined, "Violent Crime Spikes Among Arabs in Israel as Officials Admit Neglect." Killings of Arabs by Arabs have soared in Israel, the Times told readers, before darkly adding that, quote, "The prevailing assumption was as long as they're killing each other, that's their problem," end quote. Those Jews, totally okay with non-Jews murdering each other. In fact, the rising violence has attracted considerable attention from Israeli policymakers. Not only has it been a focal point of Israel's Arab parties in recent elections, but Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has called it, quote, "a national blight," and task forces have been created to study and combat the problem. Recent budgets have also reflected a greater concern for and attention to this escalating violence. However, this hasn't prevented those from using rising body counts for political purposes. Ayman Odeh of Israel's Joint List, for example, has charged that indifference lies at the core of the problem. But it's not indifference, rather, it's Iran. The Islamic Republic is helping to foment violence in Israeli Arab communities. Tehran has been sending illegal firearms and weaponry into Israel's Arab communities, and it's not speculation to say so, it's a fact. In November 2021, Israeli police revealed that Iran has been smuggling weapons to Israel's Arab communities to, quote, "sow civil strife," as the Times of Israel reported. The chief superintendent for Israel's Northern District told Israel's Channel 12 News that, quote, 95% of the smuggling from Lebanon is directed by Hezbollah, Iran's Lebanese-based terror proxy. Some of those arms are also being smuggled across the Jordanian border. The vast majority, however, seem to be coming in through Israel's northern border areas. The weapons, while destined for Israeli Arab crime organizations, quote, would also be available for terror attacks in the event of another surge in violence between Jews and Arabs, the Time of Israel reported. Some Israeli military officials have speculated that the Islamic Republic is hoping to frustrate future Israeli deployments by bogging down troops before they reach the front lines. So it's a potential fifth column. It's a very loaded term to use, but I think that's what some Israeli military officials are concerned about. Internal Security Minister Omar Bar-Lev has described the police efforts to seize illegal firearms in Israeli Arab communities as a safeguard for future military deployments. And Israel's Channel 12 reported that the flood of weapons is, quote, "a strategic threat," end quote, to the community. Now, Hezbollah has previously smuggled weapons into Israel, but recent months have witnessed a 7-fold increase in the number of arms being smuggled. And not only are the quantities greater, the quality of the weapons has also improved. Footage that I've viewed indicates that the weapons include guns like Glocks, AR-15s, M4s, many equipped with the latest optics. So these are not merely or exclusively aged Kalashnikovs and communist bloc weaponry. In fact, to be quite interested, I would assume judging by some of the footage that I viewed, that some of these weapons have actually originated from Iraq and perhaps even with US forces. Purely speculation on my part, but that's what the footage that I viewed, it seems to indicate. In July 2021, Israeli security forces seized $800,000 worth of weapons of ammunition. It was, officials told reporters, the largest stash of weapons intercepted in recent years. Footage released by Israeli Defense Forces showed the smugglers moving the material. While no arrests were announced, the IDF has said that it believes Hezbollah's involvement is likely. As one Israeli news outlet noted, Hezbollah has long maintained control over the area adjacent to the border with Israel. Accordingly, it's highly unlikely that the terrorist group would not be involved. Very little happens in those areas without Hezbollah's knowledge or acquiescence. Iran using its proxies to smuggle weapons into Israel is not and should not be considered surprising. Iran has considerable expertise in smuggling. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force uses smuggling to generate revenue, as the US Treasury Department, among other sources, has noted. IRGC's extensive criminal network utilizes Iran's numerous terrorist proxies and connections to the underworld to run drugs, guns, oil, ivory, and a host of other illicit goods. These networks traverse the globe from cigarette smuggling in the American South to running ivory on the African continent. Indeed, Iran has previously smuggled drugs into a variety of Middle East nations, including arch enemies like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Smuggling is more than an attempt to bring needed money. It also burnishes Iran's terror-making apparatus. The narcotics bring disorder and death to Tehran's opponents, and they also fill the IRGC's coffers. But Hezbollah, one Israeli police official has observed, has now moved from drugs to weapons, and in far greater quantities than before. Weapons, like narcotics, work to eat away and destroy the civil societies and social fabrics of Iran's enemies. So that Iran uses proxies to smuggle weapons to Israeli Arabs is unsurprising. It's a strategy. It dovetails with Tehran's efforts, often successful, to sow chaos in the region. Iran thrives off instability. This has always been the case. Indeed, the Islamic Republic's founders used the instability and chaos of the late 1970s Iran and early revolutionary period to gain a foothold of power. In this, they're not dissimilar from other revolutionaries, from Jacobins to Bolsheviks. And like other revolutionaries, the mullah's ambitions are staggering. Iran's strategy is aimed at delegitimizing Israel. In this sense, it's an influence operation to serve that end. By encouraging violence among Israeli Arabs, Tehran is aiding the numerous elements that are engaged in a long-running campaign to weaken the Jewish state. Growing crime in Israeli Arab neighborhoods feeds the narrative pushed by anti-Israel NGOs like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, that Israel is an apartheid state, one in which justice and societal ills are not evenly dispensed. International media is happy to promote this narrative, as coverage of the subject illustrates. A March 23, 2021 report by the Washington Post, for example, said, though they make up 1/5 of Israel's population, Arab Israelis say police and politicians are ignoring the high crime rates and poverty in their neighborhoods. That dispatch by Post correspondent Miriam Berger featured more than a dozen pictures of Israeli Arabs mourning and protesting, including an image of 3 teenage girls who painted their faces with red hands to symbolize the bloodshed in their community, the newspaper reported. But the Post failed to provide readers with essential details. The major Arab political party now sits in government. Polls show that sizable majorities would not want to be part of a Palestinian state, should one be created, for example. But this, of course, is missed in most of the reporting. Indeed, most of the reporting by foreign press outlets has failed to note the origin of many of the weapons that are being used in these crime waves. The Washington Post merely labeled it a surge in gun violence, but didn't bother to dig in terms of where the weapons came from. Should they be willing to dig deeper, they would find Iran's prints at the scene. Tehran, of course, hopes to do more than just contribute to the ceaseless propaganda war against Israel. As Jason Brodsky of United Against Nuclear Iran told me, the Islamic Republic's foreign policy and national security strategy is organized to destroy the Jewish state. Iran would be delighted if the arms that it is supplying were used in interethnic conflicts in Israel. And tragically, there's good reason to think that they already have been. In May 2021, Iranian proxies in Gaza launched a war against Israel. For 11 days, US designated terrorist groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, indiscriminately launched rockets into Israel, which responded with Operation Guardian of the Walls. The war was the fourth such conflict in the last dozen years. The latest salvo was launched by Iran, in part to test Israel's missile defense and for Hamas to capitalize on the growing weaknesses of its Fatah rival. However, it was also marked by a new ominous occurrence: violence between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. Towns like Lod, which have long had a heavily mixed population of Arabs and non-Arabs, experienced rioting and interethnic violence as rioters torched synagogues, beat soldiers, and burned cars in what the Times of Israel called, quote, some of the worst internal unrest in years. Paramedics and policemen were shot. Indeed, in Lod alone, no fewer than 5 synagogues were set ablaze. I was unable to ascertain for certain whether weapons being smuggled into Israel's Arab communities were used in this violence, but there's good reason to think that they were. The possibility exists, as does the probability. Indeed, Iran is actively working to sow civil strife in Israel. It was revealed, for example, that during the last conflict, Tehran was running a war room out of Lebanon, focused exclusively on disseminating disinformation aimed at exploiting fissures in Israel's social fabric. A recent investigation by the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, showed that Tehran was running a network on Facebook targeting Orthodox Jews, hoping to divide and inflame along ethnic and religious lines. Now, Iran, of course, is not the first country to use the tactic of divide and conquer to construct its empire and bring ruin to its enemies, nor is Israel its first victim. The Islamic Republic and its minions have made similar exertions in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, among elsewhere. It only stands to reason that Israel, its foremost enemy after the United States, will be subject to a variation of this. Iran's playbook has reaped considerable success in all of these aforementioned countries. The mullahs are not out of bounds in thinking that it could work in Israel. Indeed, if one were looking at the interethnic violence that erupted a year ago, it would seem like a good strategy, potentially, from Tehran's viewpoint. Interethnic violence in Israel presents the Islamic Republic with numerous opportunities, including those which extend beyond the propaganda war against Israel. Simply put, it's an opportunity to not only bleed Israel, but to shake the faith of all Israelis of all backgrounds in their shared future and that of the Zionist project. For anyone who paid attention to the burning of synagogues last year, the value of this can't be overstated. And Iran's playbook has other benefits too. Tehran might be hoping that Israel will be preoccupied with the smuggling of larger, deadlier munitions like precision-guided missiles, which is worth another webinar, certainly, and is a huge problem. But that is, I think, a real and present danger to Israel. But Tehran's hopes and ambitions are, I think, likely to fail. While Israel's Arab communities do face some inequities and challenges, Arabs in Israel often have a higher standard of living than in neighboring states. Israeli Arabs, of course, have served in the country's Supreme Court, held high ranks in the IDF. They run hospitals and businesses, have their own political parties, including one which is currently in the current government. And polls also show that sizable majorities of Israeli Arabs would not want to be part of a Palestinian state should one be created. The chance then of Iran's plot to create civil war in Israel is poor. But this isn't to say that it won't weaken Israel. Indeed, I think it will. And last spring, I think, clearly demonstrated that the specter of interethnic violence in Israel is regrettably real. It must not be discounted. And while the rise of violence in Israel's Arab communities is owed to a multitude of factors, Iran's role must not be discounted. Tehran has hoped to shed Israeli blood, and tragically, it has had too much success, and it might very well have more in the future. Thank you kindly for your time.
Okay, so you've generated some questions, Sean. Let's start with a long-term question. Decades ago, Israel made a choice not to be heavy-handed in certain aspects of its Arab citizens' lives. Schools were largely autonomous. They had to meet the Israeli curriculum requirements, but they were largely autonomous. And policing also. Israel hoped to have the policing done in Arab communities by Arab people. Is it possible that they were too light-handed and they missed the entry of Iran into this, what might have been a gap there?
That's a superb question. I think so. My own personal opinion, I think so. Yes. Of course, it's a delicate balance that has to be struck, and policing in minority communities, if you will, is, as it is elsewhere, very complex and very difficult. But I think that Iran has sought to, not only within Israel, but certainly within areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority itself in the West Bank and elsewhere, has sought to gain a foothold. And I think that this can't be discounted. In the past, we've seen that Iran has had PIJ and Hamas and even also Hezbollah components active, both under PA-ruled areas and also within Israel itself. So this is a complex thing. I think that it might be changing. Certainly there is a sentiment, polls show amongst Israeli Arabs that they want more police and they want more policing. You're not going to see a defund the police movement there. They want the precise opposite. Right at this point, really, it's an outcry because crime is just rapidly rising. So
you mentioned the Arabist party that is in the Israeli government, the Ra'am party. They are an Islamist party, but they are not an Iranianist party. What have they been doing since the rise in violence? Have they been working with the good guys? Have they been quiet? What's going on with Ra'am?
So, yeah, fantastic question. So they certainly have not been quiet. They have, of course, Ra'am is quite diverse itself. Some individuals have been working with the current sitting government. There's been budget increases that are aimed at addressing this issue. But I don't think that they've been quiet. There is really an outcry from their own constituents to address this issue because it is, as I noted with some of the stats I cited, it's surging.
So a listener wants to know, why is the killing of Arabs by other Arabs a benefit to Iran? How does this work for them?
Great question. It's a benefit because, well, in part, I think mostly for propaganda purposes, because you have Western media outlets and anti-Israel NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which use this as a cudgel to beat the Jewish state over the head and to effectively say, look, this is the result of inequities, it's the result of inattention, it's the result of, quote, to use Amnesty's word, apartheid. So I think that the main value is that it's propaganda, and it weakens the belief in a shared national project, which if that national project is Zionism and you are an Israeli Arab, there's a lot of work that has to be done to make sure that everybody holds a shared belief in this future. And when you have violence surging at those rates, and when the murders are remaining largely unsolved, and there's a variety of reasons for that, which I can go into later, then I think you have people starting to question the belief in Israel's future. And people, I mean, Israeli citizens. That's what Iran's aiming for. I think the chief value, however, is propaganda. And I think it's quite successful, unfortunately.
Successful both in the Arab community and in the Jewish community of Israel, as well as the media? I mean, are they making inroads in those communities? Media, of course, the media, but.
Great question. I don't think so. I've yet to see data to suggest precisely that. I think it's more outside of Israel with organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and there's disseminators at the Washington Post and New York Times and so on. There, I think it holds great value, and that I think is its greatest use. Yet to see any data to show that it's having an effect within Israel itself, but it very well could. And certainly if it goes on and it's unaddressed, I don't see why it wouldn't.
So this is another aspect of Iran that we don't really talk about. We tend to think of Iran as militarist. They build nuclear weapons, they fund terrorists, they fund Hezbollah, they do all these things. But this is a very political, yes, it has weapons, but this is the way you describe it, a very political attack on Israel. And maybe we haven't been paying enough attention to the political side of Iran's attacks.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. I completely agree with you, Shoshana.
I know it wasn't a question, but you've raised a point that I think we haven't actually discussed before here. So thank you.
It's not being addressed. And unfortunately, all the worthwhile attention that's been paid to Iran's, say, precision guided munitions, its nuclear weapons program, these, of course, are very important. But Iran excels, and what Iran really does well is asymmetrical warfare. They are, I think, a lot more sophisticated in terms of their, if you want to call this a political campaign, they're sophisticated at it, and they've had a lot of success. I think one thing that is unfortunate both for Israel's detractors and its defenders is there's this longstanding tendency to view Israel as kind of apart from the rest of the Middle East, and it's not. It's smack dab in the middle of the East, and it would be, I think, presumptuous to think that Iran's playbook, which has worked so successfully in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, so on, why wouldn't Iran apply it here? They've had such success elsewhere. I think it would be presumptuous and dangerous to think that they wouldn't in Israel, and I think they are.
So here's the question to kind of shift things around a little bit. You know, when you throw something new at the audience, they come back and they make you smarter. Do you believe, Sean, that the violent situation in Jenin on the West Bank is also ginned by Iran? And how is the PA responding to it? Are these parts of a whole, or you got one thing over here in the territories and one thing over here in Israel?
Great question. I do think that they're related. And I think that one of the big mistakes that the media has made, certainly they made it with the last conflict in the spring of last year, is this is truly a battle for influence. Hamas and Iran's other proxies think that they see an opening in the West Bank. Fatah's historically unpopular, even by Fatah's longstanding standards of being unpopular. Mahmoud Abbas, octogenarian, nearly 2 decades in power, and he's extremely unpopular, and Fatah's unpopular. And I think Iran sees an opening. That includes, of course, its proxies in Gaza, namely Hamas, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Resistance Committees. So this is, I think, a battle of influence where Iran is trying to gain a foothold in the West Bank. So I do think that this is related. Absolutely.
Great. It's one more thing to worry about. I'm going to give you 2 more things to worry about. The first is a question from a listener. Is there any pro-Iran support or pro-Iran activity among Israeli Arabs? You've mentioned that the polls show you that most Israeli Arabs are not interested in a Palestinian state. Okay. But is there pro-Iran support among the Arabs anywhere?
Great question. I don't think it's extensive, but it absolutely exists based off some polls that I've seen. And it's not so much a support for Iran and its ambitions for regional hegemony and its imperialistic goals. That's not the case. But for Israeli Arabs that are not committed to the Zionist project and are anti-Israel, which is, I would stress, is not, in my reading, is not a high number. Yes, I mean, it's whatever the solution is to end Zionism. And if that solution looks to be that Iran is the best means to carry that out, then there will be some support for it. But I don't think it's extensive.
Okay. And here's the other thing we have to worry about. And this I know we do worry about, and Israel worries about all the time. If these weapons are coming from Lebanon, if these are Hezbollah-sponsored weapons coming into Israel, that does more than aggravate the situation with Israeli Arabs. That tells you that the northern border is insecure. Does that mean that we could see people coming over that border? Does that mean that Hezbollah may have found a front that has holes in it? We don't like to think about Israel's northern front having holes in it. But if you can get guns in, what else can you get in?
Absolutely. Now, and I think that Israel has been very skilled at catching smugglers, and both of these weapons, small arms like ARs and so on, as well as other weapons that, say, come in from Syria, for example. But as always, when you read these smuggling figures of what is being caught, there's the suspicion, I think a correct suspicion, that the numbers getting through are much higher than what is being secured by Israeli border police and so on. So I think that the border is, I don't want to say it's secure, but I think the Israeli authorities have done a great job of managing to pinpoint these smuggled munitions and to catch the smugglers. But absolutely, clearly, some is getting through, and probably more than we realize, unfortunately.
Okay. I was hoping that we get some positive answers so we could end the week on an up note, but I have to think about that because I have another question here. Someone sent in. Given George Soros's and John Kerry's strong connection with current Iranian leadership and the nature of the U.S. interest in reaching a deal with Iran on a new JCPOA, do you think that all of this is being done to help them finance the problems that are being created inside of Israel? Iran was short of money under the previous administration, and under the current administration, they've got a lot more to spend.
They do have a lot more to spend, almost regardless of whether another Iran deal is reached, because of course, many of the sanctions were let go of from the get-go. We just tossed our leverage out the window. So I don't know why we did that. And certainly it's worth speculation in terms of why we did. But yes, I think that Iran is emboldened. Clearly it's emboldened. And it's making gains, not just in Israel and in the north, but you look at Yemen and elsewhere, if a lot is going right for Iran outside of Iran. So I think that, yes, the Islamic Republic is emboldened. It has the means which it didn't have several years ago. I mean, indeed, prior to the last administration coming in, we were squeezing them by the throat. And Iran's economic situation was quite dire, actually. That's no longer the case.
And we heard yesterday in a meeting, someone said that on the eve of the Biden administration's inauguration, Iran was down to $4 billion in its pot, according to the International Monetary Fund, and it's somewhere over 126 billion now. So if you have all that money, I'm sure you can find lots of ways to spend it. And one of them, I guess, is ginning up violence in the Israeli Arab community. So,
and I should note as well
and I don't want to say that the Biden administration is responsible for what's going on in Israel. I absolutely do not want to say that. I would simply point out that helping Iran have the means to pay for what it wants makes a difference.
It does. And we also, and I think it's worth noting, years ago, I think in 2014, then the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, a guy named Michael Flynn, also testified before Congress saying that this is precisely what Iran would do with increased cash flows. They would, of course, send it to their terrorist networks, and that would include Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So you mentioned in answering the question, you mentioned in answering the question that a lot of the murders in Israel of Israeli Arabs remain unsolved. And you said you had some additional information on that. We have someone who asks if you would please expand that answer a little bit.
Absolutely. So solving crimes in many of these neighborhoods and communities are, by all accounts, quite difficult. Much of this violence is clan violence. There's been instances in which the police will show up to say a homicide and bodies have been moved, evidence has been tampered with. And also importantly, reporting. Of course, one of the main issues is reporting crimes and giving information to police. And that is a very difficult thing, I think the Israeli police have found in many of these neighborhoods. People don't want to report the crimes. They don't want to often tell authorities what they know. And as I mentioned, there's been instances in which evidence has been tampered with. So if you have a citizenry in certain neighborhoods that don't want to tell police what they know, that of course makes solving crimes much more difficult. And when a lot of this violence, not all of it, but a lot of it is clan feuds, there's also a kind of a cooked in incentive to not report it, just by virtue of, the opposing clan saying, well, we're going to strike back and we'll make amends that way instead of telling the Israeli police what's going on. So I think that those are major contributing factors, because if you do look at it, the amount of homicides that have been solved in these Israeli Arab neighborhoods is staggeringly less than the fewer homicides that are committed in non-Arab neighborhoods. And I think those are reasons why. So
that actually seems to vindicate Israel's decision not to be heavy-handed with Jewish police in Arab neighborhoods. If this is family-oriented or feud-oriented, it seems to me that the better police to be working on it are those Israeli Arab police, which may argue for lots more Israeli Arab police if you can recruit them.
Right. I think that's completely correct, and there are models for this, in other areas, say in Europe, where there's majority minority communities where they also have clan feuds, reluctance to report information to police, or for that matter, in the United States here itself, things like some of the issues on reservations come to mind. So I think that these are real problems, and potentially one way of addressing it would be increasing Israeli Arab police recruitment,
which I would have to assume the Israeli government is already thinking about working on. I know that was part of Ra'am's approach to government. You need more resources in those neighborhoods, and not just police, but more resources. So maybe that's where Ra'am is spending its political capital. And
there has been significant budget increases aimed at addressing this that have passed within the last year. So I think there is reason for optimism there, to strike one optimistic note.
I was going to say, maybe we should just stop right now, because if you get to an optimistic note, maybe that's...
I only allow one optimistic comment a webinar. So
right, well, we've had ours then. Okay, I accept now that we're on the other side. I usually hold it for the end, but never mind. We're going to keep going, because I have a couple more questions before we get to the end of our program. This one's a kind of a ringer question. I don't know if you have any sense of where this goes, but I thought a good question. The United States left an enormous amount of equipment in Afghanistan last summer, just billions actually of dollars worth of stuff. Now, some of it is big stuff that isn't part of this question. The question here is, Iran and the Taliban have good relations. Is it possible that you're finding a movement of US equipment from Afghanistan into Iran, and perhaps even beyond Iran, to the other battlefields, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah?
Yes, it is possible. And I think it's indeed, I would actually argue that it's likely, not only here in Israel, but in elsewhere that are relevant to Iran's regional ambitions, Yemen, so on. Many of these weapons will come out of Afghanistan. And, it's I don't want to say it's funny, because it's most certainly not. But I've recently been reading a book called First Casualty, which has to do with CIA efforts in early Afghanistan. And there was this huge program to try and get back the Stinger missiles back in the 1980s that were given to the Mujahideen to take out the Soviets. And in fact, there were CIA officials in Afghanistan on the eve of 9/11 explicitly for that purpose. So here we are again, but the difference is with small arms, your maintenance culture. So you have to have what's known, maintenance culture to take care of a Chinook helicopter, for example, if that's left behind. But you don't have to have much of a maintenance culture to take care of M4s. So the ability to get those weapons, send them to the minions, especially if you're the cash-strapped Taliban, I think that's quite high.
So it's another scary bit of fallout from running out on Afghanistan. Okay, another question sent in. I can read it. Okay, there is an embargo against Russian oil in large parts of the world, so we're not buying. How does that affect Iran's financial situation? Does that make them richer? Because the Biden administration has been giving waivers on Iranian oil.
Yes, that's
Are we trading one bad guy for another bad guy here?
Yes, we are. And of course, and it needs to be understood as well that, Russia and Iran are allies. So if Iran gets a surplus of cash, be it from oil, sanctions relief, so on, well, for years, most of Iran's weapons have been bought from Russia. So they're just going to take that cash, turn around, buy from Russia, and Russia's effectively getting that, some relief anyways. So I think that's worth noting. But yes, Iran, and this is also a selling point for those who are advocating for the JCPOA. They're saying, disingenuously, I should note, that we have Americans are tired of paying high prices at the pump, and we have this issue with Russia. We can get some relief by getting some oil from Iran. Now the numbers don't add up. That's not going to make, you're not going to be paying significantly less at the pump because we're getting oil from Iran in the event of another Iran deal. That's not going to happen. But for those who really want a deal, that is the talking point.
Yeah, hoping to lower, I guess, the world price. The same is true, apparently, of Venezuelan oil. We have approached the dictators in Venezuela saying, pump more oil, pump more. They can't pump more oil. They cannot. They haven't done maintenance, they're just not prepared to do it, but anything to keep us from pumping our own oil, I suppose, sounds like a good idea.
What could go wrong?
But it sounds like it's a good idea. Anything to keep us clean. All right, last question, I think, and then I'm going to try to get you to end us on a positive note, because I think you should do that. Is it your understanding, and I know this is hard to figure yet because it's still happening, are Israeli Arabs among those who are being arrested on the Temple Mount, or are those primarily West Bank Arabs? Is there a coalescence or convergence between the problems of violence inside Israeli Arab communities and the problem of violence on the Temple Mount? Or are they ginned up in two different ways?
Great question. I'd be reluctant to answer definitively because I haven't seen any stats that would perhaps break it down in terms of Israeli Arabs that have been arrested on the Temple Mount or those that are identified as Palestinians from the West Bank. So I'd be reluctant to posit an answer on that. But I do think that in terms of rhetorically and propaganda, there absolutely is a link. There is a link. And what is happening on the Temple Mount is something that Arabs, I think, a portion in Israel, and of course, certainly in the West Bank and elsewhere, are going to be paying attention to. And we know that that's historically been the case before Israel's recreation even.
Okay, so we've come to that moment. And people that listen to us know that I really, really don't like to go out on a negative note. Your last answer was fairly positive. I mean, maybe we're not seeing Israeli Arabs. I mean, that would be a huge jump in the kind of violence, to have them going up on the Temple Mount and do those sorts of things. So maybe that's optimistic. What's the potential for the future? Israeli Arabs have one of the highest income levels in the region. They have one of the highest educational levels in the region. The majority of Israeli pharmacists are Israeli Arab women, which I don't know why, but interesting, first of all, because they're very well educated women. Secondly, pharmacy is not so simple, right? So if things in the economic and even in the social sense have been pretty much in their favor, and yet you have Iran's ability to create havoc for them and their own communities, how do we get out of that? I mean, you can't just offer them more money. You can't, because that's not the answer. What's the answer?
That is a fantastic question. I think to one thing I will say is that there's a lot of problems, I suppose, with being a democracy. You're going to be slower to address issues. Things are going to be more complex. You're not going to have the push and immediacy of, say, an authoritarian government. But one of the benefits is you will have a level of responsiveness. And I think that we see that. And things like having a majority of Israeli Arabs or a majority of pharmacists being Israeli Arab females, that matters. And that matters not a little bit, that matters quite a lot, I would say. The statistics and the opportunities that are available for Israeli Arabs in terms of education, higher quality of life, ability to serve in businesses, ability to serve in government, so on. All of that matters a lot. So I actually still think that the future writ large is fairly bright, despite this dour tone that I've adopted and some of the points that I brought up. And while this is a huge problem, it's also worth noting that it's not the first time that there have been issues in Israel's majority-minority areas or even issues with Israeli Arabs. So I think that, taking a long view and going back, since 1948, and certainly some of the issues that Israel had in the 1950s with Israeli Arab population, I think writ large, the future is actually quite bright, because things like having the majority of pharmacists being Israeli Arab women, that's huge. That's not something that should, I think, be just, you shouldn't just turn the page over. So writ large, I think that the future of Israel, the future of Zionist project, if you will, I think those are all quite, I would put a sunny forecast on all that. And I'd also note that that Israel's ability to target smugglers coming in from the north is, as I said, it's quite good. And they've demonstrated the level of intelligence that Israeli officials have in terms of smuggling, both in Lebanon and in Syria, is, I think, demonstrably good in terms of their ability to attack things like PGMs or other munitions being smuggled. So I would definitely, you can mark me down as optimistic on that score. But this is a huge problem, and it's one that does deserve attention.
It certainly does. And so I'm going to extract a promise from you to come back and give us an update, because I think it is important. I think you're right. The Israelis are primed to address it, and Ra'am is primed to address it. And I'd love to know how it goes. So we want you back, Sean. Will you come back?
Gladly do it.
Okay, great. Let me thank you for a really enlightening program. Way off where I thought we were going to be with Iran at this point, but absolutely essential program. And to our viewers, next week, we're back to Thursday. We have the really terrific Elbridge Colby with us. Watch the time, though, because we are going to move, as a favor to our California constituency, we're going to move to later in the afternoon on Thursday. So you will get your notice from us for Thursday afternoon next week, and a great program with Elbridge Colby, following a great program with Sean Durns. Sean, thank you very much.
Thank you.